Hi, thank you for taking the time to view this brief overview of the different methods of procurement allowed under the Uniform Guidance. As most of you know, the Uniform Guidance was implemented for fiscal years that began after December 26, 2014. However, non-federal entities received a 2-year grace period in which the implementation of the procurement requirements under the Uniform Guidance could be delayed. For example, for entities with June 30 fiscal year ends, the new effective date for the procurement requirement is July 1, 2017. Let's begin by looking at the first of 5 methods of procurement required by the Uniform Guidance. Micro-purchases. Micro-purchases are those purchases of homogeneous goods or services that do not exceed $3,500. Please note that this threshold is subject to change. This means you should check for changes to these thresholds periodically to ensure that your entity's policies and procedures are in compliance. Purchases under this threshold do not require quotes. However, prices paid should be determined to be reasonable and, if practicable, must be made amongst qualified suppliers. Small purchases. Small purchases are those purchases of like goods or services that are above the micro-purchase threshold but are below the simplified acquisition threshold, or $150,000. Similar to the micro-purchase threshold, the simplified acquisition threshold is subject to change. Again, this means that you must periodically check for updates to the Uniform Guidance. Under the small purchase method of procurement, you are required to obtain quotes from a reasonable number of qualified vendors. However, you should check current state and/or your entity's current procurement policies. If these policies are more restrictive than the Uniform Guidance, the more restrictive guidelines should be followed. For example, the Arizona Administrative Code for school district procurements require quotes to be obtained for purchases between $10,000 and $100,000, which is more restrictive, as the $100,000 threshold is well below the simplified acquisition threshold. Because it is more restrictive, Arizona school districts must comply with the more restrictive Arizona Administrative Code. Sealed bids. Sealed bids or competitive proposals, which are covered on the next level, are required for purchases of like goods or services that are above the simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently $150,000. If the purchases exceed this threshold and the sealed bid method of procurement is used, the following requirements apply. Bids must be solicited from an adequate number of known suppliers, and for tribal and local governments must be publicly advertised with sufficient time for suppliers to respond. There must be at least 2 bidders. The invitation for bids must define items or services. All bids will be open at the time and place prescribed by the invitation for bids. A firm fixed price contract award will be made in writing to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. Again, you must check your state's and your own entity's policies. If these policies are more restrictive than the Uniform Guidance, then the more restrictive policies should be followed. For example, the Arizona Administrative Code for school district procurements requires a competitive bid or proposal procurement for purchases that exceed $100,000 along with other additional documentation requirements that the Uniform Guidance does not require. Because the threshold and additional documentation requirements in the Arizona Administrative Code are more restrictive than the Uniform Guidance, the Arizona Administrative Code requirements must be followed. Competitive proposals. Competitive proposals are required for purchases of like goods or services that are above the simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently $150,000. If the purchases exceed this threshold and it was determined that conditions to use a sealed bid was not appropriate, the following requirements apply. Requests for proposals must be solicited publicly and identify all evaluation factors and their relative importance. Proposals must be solicited from an adequate number of qualified sources. There must be a written method for conducting technical evaluations of the proposals. Contracts must be awarded to the responsible supplier whose proposal is most advantageous. Again, you must check state and your own entity's policies. If these policies are more restrictive than the Uniform Guidance, then the more restrictive policies should be followed. Non-competitive proposals. Non-competitive proposals are allowed under different circumstances. One method of a non-competitive proposal is if the item or service is only available from one source. For example, utility companies in your area are likely the only suppliers that provide you with that utility. A second method of a non-competitive proposal is if there is a public emergency requirement that will not permit a delay from competitive solicitation. For example, if a school is flooded and repairs must occur immediately for the safety of the children and the continuation of school operations. A third method of non-competitive proposal is if the federal awarding agency or the pass-through entity expressly authorizes the non-competitive proposal in response to a written request from the non-federal entity. Lastly, if after soliciting numerous vendors and you are unable to obtain enough competition, this can be used as a method of a non-competitive proposal. One more time, check your state and any specific policies. These policies are more restrictive, and the restrictive policies must be followed. Thank you for viewing this brief overview of the different methods of procurement allowed under the Uniform Guidance. As is the case for all things compliance, the key to being compliant is to document, and document some more. If you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to contact me.